Decoded.
Welcome back, curious minds, to Book Decoded. Ever wonder what makes nations tick economically? Today we're diving into a fascinating study. It's from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it looks back through, well, centuries really, trying to help us understand the present, maybe even peek into the future of how countries deal with each other economically.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach.
Think way back. You had ancient empires using trade to build power. Then, fast forward to Adam Smith, modern economic thinking starting, him looking at mercantilism.
Right, that whole dynamic between nations and their economies has always been a huge driver.
Exactly. And this book, The New Economic Nationalism, it digs into this idea that's definitely back in the spotlight, economic nationalism. So what is it exactly? Where did it come from? And, what can history tell us about how it actually plays out? That's what we're trying to unpack today.
Okay, let's get into it. The book defines economic nationalism as policies that kind of move away from the usual liberal consensus. And they do it for nationalist reasons. Basically, a country prioritizing its own economic interests, which might mean, some downsides for other countries, at least in the short term.
Okay, so it's not always about just building a wall forever, like permanent protectionism.
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
The definition they use is actually quite broad. It includes policies aimed at, say, leveling the playing field. Think maybe temporary tariffs for infant industries or restrictions on investment from certain countries until they, quote, play by market rules. They use China as an example there.
Okay, so it's nuanced. It's not just one thing.
Exactly. It's not automatically about one winner and one loser.
Right. So who are some of the leaders today who are associated with this kind of thinking or these policies?
Well, the book mentions a really interesting mix, actually, across the whole political spectrum globally. They name people like Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, Emmanuel Macron, Giorgia Meloni, Narendra Modi, even Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in the UK.
Wow. That's a very diverse group. So it's definitely not just confined to one political ideology or one part of the world.
Precisely. And, to really understand why this is bubbling up again, the book takes us back through history.
The history. Always good for context. Where does it start?
Way back. Ancient empires like Rome, the Han Dynasty in China. These empires, they used trade, taxes, investment. These were tools to build wealth and, importantly, fund their militaries.
So even then, this link between economic strength and national power was clear.
Absolutely. But the book suggests it really crystallizes with mercantilism, maybe 17th, 18th centuries, as global trade and empires grew. Adam Smith, of course, wrote a lot about that.
Mercantilism, right? That's the whole aggressively pursuing your own national economic advantage idea. Protectionism, colonies, that sort of thing.
That's the heart of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Britain, France, Spain, later Germany, Japan, they were all doing it. Protecting home industries, using colonies for resources, trying to get the biggest slice of the pie.
Okay, so let's jump to now. Why is this idea making such a comeback? We're not quite in the age of empires like that anymore, are we?
Good question. The book points to a few things. One is this growing skepticism about multilateral cooperation, international agreements, global bodies. They're sometimes seen as, well, getting in the way of national sovereignty, limiting what a nation can do for itself.
So a desire for more national control makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And that often connects with rising nativist feelings, especially in Europe and the U.S. Concerns about immigration being a big part of right-of-center politics there.
Interesting connection. Okay, but how do you actually measure economic nationalism? It sounds a bit fuzzy.
It can be. But the book uses these policy scales, which is quite clever. They look at specific things like how much does a country resist international cooperation? That's anti-multilateralism. How much trade protectionism is there? Tariffs, quotas, then immigration restrictions, rules around foreign direct investment, how much the government tries to boost specific industries, that's vertical industrial policy. Also, how much they tolerate big companies dominating markets, and even macroeconomic populism.
Macroeconomic populism. How does that fit with nationalism? Isn't that more about, risky spending for elections?
Well, the authors distinguish it a bit. They see it as often more about short-term political wins or redistribution, not necessarily core nationalist ideology.
Yeah.
But they include it because it's a shift in policy preferences that can sometimes overlap or align with nationalist goals.
Got it. Okay, so using these scales, what's the trend? Are we seeing more economic nationalism overall?
Yeah, their findings point pretty clearly to an increase since around the mid-2010s, For high-income economies, they highlight Italy and the U.S. as showing the biggest shifts across several scales. And among emerging markets, Russia, South Africa, and India stand out.
That feels like a pretty major global shift. Really makes you wonder about the consequences, the real-world impact.
It does. And that's where the historical case studies come in. The book digs into several examples to see what happened when countries went down this path before.
Case studies, right? Always revealing. Where do they start?
They look at Italy, under Mussolini, between the wars. Fascism, obviously, heavily emphasized national identity, aiming to unite the country beyond class, with a big focus on industrial strength.
And the policies, what did that look like economically?
Well, it shifted. Started with some liberal reforms, but then moved more towards state intervention. Protectionism, the battle for grain, to boost food self-sufficiency, compulsory industry cartels.
But initially, they kept things like migration and investment fairly open. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, but Italy was short on capital early on, so they needed foreign money, and immigration was seen as a safety valve. But that changed later. They actually tried to reduce the labor supply, shorter work weeks but with lower pay, lifting immigration restrictions, pushing women out of industrial jobs.
Wow, that's quite a reversal.
It was. And then things got tough economically. They abandoned the gold standards. The lira was overvalued. Reserves were falling. Protectionism ramped up. They rejected international cooperation, especially during the Depression. And increasingly, economic policy just became about preparing for war. Macroeconomic populism surged then, too.
So the outcome, did Italy become this industrial powerhouse?
Well, government spending stayed high, and GDP did get back above pre-crisis levels by 37. But the share of that going to ordinary people, private consumption, actually fell. Wage controls, trade restrictions, those cartels, they ended up hurting productivity and what people could actually buy.
So a kind of mixed bag, maybe growth on paper, but not necessarily better lives.
Something like that. The key takeaway seems to be that suppressing consumption and distorting markets, even for nationalist goals, can really hamper long-term prosperity.
Right. What about Nazi Germany around the same time?
Their first big push was unemployment. Massive job creation schemes, Autobahn, housing, infrastructure, ran up the deficit doing it, and they put in really tight controls on foreign currency leaving the country. Tariffs, quotas, bilateral deals to get essential imports.
And the rearmament, that must have been huge.
Totally dominant after 35 or 36.
Yeah.
Everything, all policy was geared towards military buildup. They rated Germany a 5 on all policy categories then. Interestingly, unemployment did drop spectacularly fast in the first year and a half.
Which must have seemed like a huge success at the time compared to elsewhere.
Absolutely. And the unique thing there was how the war effort just dictated trade policy. They basically fused the economy with the military machine. A defense economy, they called it.
Okay, so those are two pretty intense pre-war examples. What about after World War II? France, for instance. How did they rebuild?
Post-war France went for state-led modernization. Industrial policy, guiding credit, indicative planning. They used trade barriers at first to shield domestic firms, let them get back on their feet. But, unlike Italy maybe, they also pushed for competition between French firms, anti-cartel laws, and so on.
So protecting from the outside, but encouraging efficiency inside.
Kind of, yeah. And they were pretty focused on controlling inflation, which was central to their credit policy. Didn't fall into that macroeconomic populism trap as much. Over time, the focus shifted more to productivity, building up national champions. Government directing investment credit was key to capital accumulation.
And Spain under Franco. Also authoritarian, but a different path.
It started that way, but shifted gradually towards a market economy from the early 50s, partly due to public pressure, actually.
Okay.
Then the 1959 National Stabilization Plan really cemented that, moved free market resource allocation, macroeconomic stability, less direct state control.
Less state control. Okay.
Yeah, macroeconomic populism went down, though the state still had a guiding hand with things like four-year plans for industry. After 59, they saw really rapid, sustained growth. Devaluing the currency helped kickstart an export boom, and wage controls kept costs down.
Okay, now Japan. That's the classic post-war success story, often linked to a specific kind of economic model.
Right, what the book calls developmental economic nationalism, very export-focused, strategic protection for key industries, and definitely favoring domestic firms over foreign ones, especially early on.
Weren't export cartels part of that?
Yes, the Export Transactions Law allowed them. With government, okay. Plus tax breaks for exporting, government support for those big trading companies, the Sogo Shosha. And MIT, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, was famous for its administrative guidance. coordinating industries, trying to stop excessive competition within Japan.
So very hands-on government steering things towards exports.
Very much so. Special tax measures for target industries, gradual trade opening, but always protecting domestic players. That famous income doubling plan. And the Bank of Japan was crucial, funding banks and firms. It fueled this amazing high-growth period with stable prices and the benefits spreading quite widely. It really shows how effective that strategic export-led model could be in that context.
A very deliberate strategy. What about Taiwan and South Korea, often grouped with Japan?
Similar paths in some ways. Both started with import substitution, making things at home instead of importing. Then they shifted hard towards exports. Lots of state intervention in both, controlling credit, direct government involvement in key sectors, textiles in Taiwan, for instance. Land reform was huge in Taiwan, too. Both had big export promotion programs. They encouraged foreign investment, but often with strings-attached export targets, technology transfer requirements.
Differences between them.
Taiwan was apparently very focused on keeping inflation low. South Korea had perhaps more direct government control over credit flows, and famously, the president chaired monthly export promotion meetings. And South Korea had that big push into heavy and chemical industries later on.
Okay, let's contrast that with Latin America. Brazil and Argentina took a different route.
Yeah, they also did import substitution under Vargas in Brazil and Perón in Argentina. But they ran into recurring problems, balance of payments crises, high inflation. In Brazil, state-owned companies were the main investment vehicle, and subsidies often created monopolies. Policy was quite volatile, too. Argentina had high tariffs protecting industry, but ironically, that made them more dependent on imported industrial inputs. Inflation and overvalued currency were persistent issues, leading to those boom-bust cycles.
And finally, the more recent cases, China and India. What's the picture there, according to the book?
In China, especially under Xi Jinping, there's been a shift. Less market-enhancing, more goal-oriented state direction. Big emphasis on state-owned national champions. Still promoting exports, still using foreign investment for technology transfer, but also that Chinese dream idea, national rejuvenation, global power, and the party tightening control over private firms. India, under Modi, has the Make in India push for domestic manufacturing. They've raised tariffs on things like mobile phones, preferential treatment for local suppliers and government contracts, some easing of FDI rules in certain areas, but also, the book notes, a more restrictive social climate, particularly targeting minority groups, and increased industrial concentration.
Okay, that's a lot of history and policy. Let's try to tie this together for you, our listener. This dive into the new economic nationalism really shows that this push and pull, between national interests and the global economy, it's definitely not new. We've seen all these different countries, different pressures, different ideologies, using economic tools to try and, boost their own standing. And here's where it gets really interesting. Whether it was Mussolini's Italy chasing industrial power or post-war Japan building export muscle or Make in India today, this instinct to prioritize the home team, it takes so many forms. And the results, they're complex. Sometimes growth, sometimes stagnation, almost always unintended side effects.
Yeah, what's fascinating is how the why behind it is its security, catching up, reacting to a crisis that often shapes the how, the actual policies used, and of course the results you get. And stepping back, it really throws light on that constant debate. What is the state's role in the economy? How do you balance national goals with global realities?
So what's the takeaway for you navigating the world today?
Well, understanding these historical patterns, the core ideas of economic nationalism, it gives you a lens, right? A way to analyze current events, trade wars, immigration debates, industrial policy fights. It makes you ask, okay, who really benefits here? What are the long-term trade-offs involved? And maybe here's a final thought to chew on. Given how hyper-connected everything is now, economically speaking, can any nation really succeed by just going it alone? Or are we just fated to keep wrestling with this balancing act national interests versus global interdependence? Something to mull over until our next Book Decoded adventure.
Indeed. It really questions how we even define national success in such an intertwined world. Good thought to end on.